Welcome to the Can You Even podcast, a space where real life stories prove that no matter what life throws your way, you can. I'm your host, Candace McCormick, and as someone living with spinal muscular atrophy, I've faced my own share of challenges, but I've learned that with the right mindset, anything is possible. On this podcast, I have the privilege of sharing stories from incredible people who have faced life's twists and turns, overcome challenges, and found their own version of you can. These conversations are all about finding strength, hope, and purpose, even in the hardest moments. So get comfy, turn up the volume, and get ready, because these stories might just shift your perspective in a way you never saw coming. Hello everyone, it's me, Candace, and I'm here with my next guest for our next episode, the lovely Tia Bell with Unscripted Co. And as always, I'm going to toss it over to Tia because I think there's nobody better to introduce ourselves like ourselves.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. I like that because I like to do my introductions a little bit different. I know a lot of people like to start with kind of who they are in the sense of like in relation to others, but I more like to start with my qualities first because I think it's important. So I'm a relationship person. Relationships come up a lot for me in the sense of how I make my decisions. So, and we'll hear that in my story today that like it very much impacted my decision making. And so, yeah, very much relationships is key for me. It's a huge value of mine, as well as curiosity. I was always one of those like why kids. I don't know if you grew up that way too, but I had to ask my grandma a couple years ago just things about what I was like when I was younger. She's like, "Oh, you asked why all of the time. Why this? Why that?" And I was like, "Oh, that hasn't changed." I'm a very curious person. I'm not so much questioning things out of kind of like a cynical way, but more questioning in a way of, I wonder if we could do better, or I wonder more about that, or just kind of wanting to wander and explore into those topics or into that curiosity. So
Right.
yeah, I like to start kind of there, and then I'll share too the other aspects of me. I've been with my partner since we were 15. Well, I was 15,
Oh,
so that's like 20 years now. We've been married for 11 years, I think, which is pretty sweet. Still going
awesome.
strong.
Awesome.
We have an 8-year-old kiddo who she makes us laugh so much. She's the funniest person ever. I love her so much. She challenges me, but in like all the right ways, which is awesome. I'm also a social worker. I'm a registered social worker. That's the career path I went down. And then I'm the owner of Unscripted Co, which is my counseling private practice that I've owned for the last 5 years now, which is pretty sweet to see. I'll be going on to year 6 here soon. Which
That's
is, yeah,
wild.
I can't believe that.
It's
Yeah,
just
I
it's
think
like,
that covers it.
yeah, I think it's like so shocking because I think when I first, like, I think we've always kind of known of each other, but when I first got
Yeah.
to know you more, I think you were just like starting with
Yeah,
Unscripted. So that's very interesting, and I can't believe how time flies.
I know.
So yeah, I think like what we are talking about today, I'm very excited about, not because of the title of it all, but we're talking from burnout to breakthrough. And I think that your story is one that many people relate to because I think burnout is something that we all suffer from. I'm going to say suffer because it's not a fun time, but we also can really get stuck in that burnout life and not know like what steps to take and where to go and how to get out of it. And so, yeah, I think that's really exciting. So we chatted a little bit. So you ended up going on a medical leave because of extreme burnout. And then you chatted and said like you quit 3 days into your leave and then you ended up starting your own business with. Seriously, I'm like, well, didn't that just start more burnout? Because I ran my own business for 10 years as well. And it's a lot of work.
It is, yeah.
So yeah, maybe just like start wherever you would like to start with that story and we'll kind of just chatter on from there.
Yeah. Well, maybe let's start with kind of where the burnout, where
Yes.
I noticed the burnout, especially like a social worker or lots of different professions is kind of known that you're going to get burnt out. It's almost like as you're learning your profession and as you're training to become whoever you are, it's like, oh, and at some point you're going to burn out. And so
Right.
I've always had that in the back of my mind. I worked in a nonprofit for in the domestic violence sector. So I had that in the back of my mind. I was like, I'm going to have really good boundaries because I'm not going to be a statistic. I'm not going to be another social worker that gets burnt out. I even remember one of my practicums when I was in university. I went and I was meeting all the people at the practicum, and my supervisor had just kind of sidely said, and that's so and so, don't talk to her. She's really burnt out. And at that time, as a new, like, little young social worker, I was like, oh, that's scary. Okay, yeah, I'll avoid that person. Now,
Right.
in retrospect, I was like, oh, that is so sad that that person was very clearly identified as burnt out and ignored and completely isolated rather than given that support. Now,
Right.
that was like back in 2011, 2012 or something like that. So I'm hoping things have changed a little bit, and that's part of the work that I do now too, is hoping to change that narrative as well. So
Right.
yeah, so it was in the back of my mind, I'm going to have good boundaries, leave work at work. I'm not going to be another person that gets burnt out. We've had lots of different people come in that will do the training about compassion fatigue, which is just kind of getting overexhausted with the supports that we provide. And I was like, yeah, I'm good, until I wasn't. And then I realized that everything I knew about burnout was not exactly what burnout is.
Okay.
I feel like I was bamboozled in a way, but mostly just from ignorance. And I think there was just a lot of not knowing. So yeah. So
Which I think like that's probably maybe elaborate that on a little bit as to like what did you think burnout was and then what did you realize it actually was?
yeah. So I thought burnout was where you just became exhausted from the client work or overwhelmed by the client work that you were doing. Typically, especially in nonprofits, we have limited budgets, low pay, and also trying to do the best that we can within the limitations that we have. So I was like, oh yeah, burnout's going to be something within that. And I also thought that burnout was going to be more where I was impacted because of a tragic story that I was working with or something like that, and that it would just hit me too hard.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't. It was things that, because those things I knew were outside of my control, and so they didn't really impact me in the way that maybe I thought it was going to. It was the things that felt that were more in my control that started to exhaust me. Burnout actually there's three categories to it. So one that people most identify with is the exhaustion or the energy depletion. And like describing it different than if you were hiking a mountain or if you went on, like, had a really long day, started at 6 a.m. and going all the way until 10 p.m. and you're just like exhausted for that day. This energy depletion is ongoing. You wake up, you're exhausted, you just don't have the motivation, you're just noticing those things. So there's energy depletion. Another one is the cynicism or more detachment from the work that you're doing, where you're kind of questioning, like, oh, why is that person, they just got a promotion, or I'm doing all the work. Why am I the one that has to do all the work and then Sally just gets to go and take another vacation? Or, just those little things. Of course, management isn't going to let us do this. Like, these are like the little cynical things that we start to say to ourselves.
Right.
Or just for me, what happened was certain projects that I was on, they were starting to be just shifted around to different groups. I'm losing my words, which is not great for a podcast, but
It's okay.
they were being moved to other teams, not because I wasn't
Okay.
doing a good job, but it made sense for them to be kind of attached to a different team.
Right.
And I didn't fight for them and I didn't care, even though generally I'm a very passionate person, and the projects that I work on, I'm like, oh, this is meaningful for me. This is why I would want to do it. But it started to slowly trickle away and I just didn't care. I was like, whatever. Less work for me, I guess. I don't need it. And then the other piece is your professional efficacy goes down, which means not necessarily your ability to do good work, but how you perceive your work could be going. You could be doing worse. You could be like not completing things on time. You could be doing a lot of things, making a lot more mistakes, but there could also be the perceived mistakes that you're making where you're like, wow, I'm really sucking at my job lately. I just keep doing the same thing over and over again. Or that was a terrible session I had, or something like that.
Right.
So a mixture of those. Some people have all three. Some
Yeah.
people will identify strongly with one or two, but those over a long period of time is what really contributes to the burnout. So you can
Right.
have a moment where maybe those things happen, but it gets rectified fairly quickly. But if it doesn't get rectified, then it just seeps into everything and it's
Right.
really draining. And that's what started to happen to me. And I know the moment it happened, but it took
Really?
6 months later for me to realize that I was in burnout because, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you want to know the
That's
moment?
really interesting because um I don't know if you know this about me, but I also work nonprofit for
Mm-hmm.
5 years. I'm curious. I do feel like there's a lot of burnout in a nonprofit
Oh, yeah.
role. Looking back, I realized I was burned out, but I couldn't pinpoint it. So maybe share a little bit more
Oh,
about that because that's interesting
yeah.
to me.
And I think it's just because, again, that curious part of myself. But I really needed to know how it happened when I was doing so good with boundaries and I was doing
Right.
right. I didn't take work home. I didn't work extra hours than I needed to. There was all these things. So when I was in about year 5 of working at the nonprofit, I really had been working towards some leadership growth. I was ready
Okay.
to make some changes. I wanted to get onto the leadership team, but we were such a flat organization. It was like frontline leadership, executive director. Like that was,
Okay.
there wasn't a whole lot of layering between things. And so when we had leadership changes, it was often reducing the amount of leaders rather than increasing the amount of leaders. So I was getting really stuck in, okay, I feel like I've really understand the work that I'm doing. I enjoyed the work that I was doing, but I wanted growth. I wanted something beyond this. It was just becoming kind of like the same stuff over and over again. So I started looking at like some coaching and things like that too, which was great. There was a leadership program, a coaching leadership program that I took. So that
Okay.
kind of got me interested in building up my leadership skills for
Right.
whenever the opportunity struck. And there was also this path that I knew I could take too, where a colleague of mine was maybe going to be moving on to another sector of our establishment, of our nonprofit. And so I was going to take her role. So it was kind of a
Mm.
side leadership role, but it was going to be fairly different. So I was going to take her role. She was going to go on to more of a management position.
Right.
And then she got laid off. And I was like, this is the first layoff we had ever experienced. So it
Okay.
wasn't normal for our work to do any layoffs. She was somebody that had worked there well before I had been there. So she had been there for a really long time. Somebody I looked up to, did amazing work, and got laid off. And I was like, okay, nothing's permanent. And this is also now the only path that I had forward has now been completely closed. So I still am stuck at frontline and not having the ability to do anything about it. And so that was the triggering moment, like the little
Okay.
catalyst that then started seeping into all the other pieces, where slowly over time the different projects I was working on were moved to other areas. And I was
Okay.
like, whatever, that's fine. I don't care anymore. And just noticing my just lack of wanting to be there.
Mm-hmm.
And it just ended up just creating this darkness inside. And so
Mm.
I think at work, I still looked productive. I had ways of being productive because I was like, oh, I'm going to start this new resource finder where I'm going to get like all the resources and all the communities and really have this really good resource finder. And so I would talk it up as if something that I was doing this thing, but then I would go sit in my office and just stare at the screen and do absolutely nothing because I was just exhausted. I had no energy. I had no motivation. And then I
Well,
would
there's
get up and
probably like a
interrupt
little
people.
bit of what's the word I'm looking for? Not like resentment, but you're like, I've been working and taking action and steps to become the next level, and then that just was like stripped away from you.
Yeah.
So like there
Yeah.
was nowhere for you to go.
Yeah. So part of the cynical piece is really um, uh that distrust is there. That
Yeah.
connection
Yes.
is gone. So my connection and trust with management or the future of my career, because again, I was still figuring things out. I knew what I was doing, but I wanted to grow more. I knew I was capable
Yeah.
of more, but this was gone. But I didn't trust anyone to support me.
Totally.
And like, how could they? Right. Because all of a sudden we had an experience that none of us had experienced before. So there was a lot of distrust that started to trickle down.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I noticed, like, the things that I really noticed was more, I said, I didn't know for about 6 months that it was actually burnout that I was in. And it was actually me at home. I was not somebody that I wanted to be. I was a mom that was snapping a lot, getting really frustrated with my daughter for things that like kids just do, but I
Right.
couldn't handle it. I couldn't maintain I couldn't regulate my own emotions with things.
Mm.
I stopped doing a lot of the other extra things that I wanted to do. I wasn't really finding enjoyment from going out and seeing friends or things like that. So, very similar in some ways to like a depressive period. You're just withdrawing and just like I felt gross and I felt nasty. And I also felt a lot of physical pain too. And I had high blood pressure. And that was what eventually was like my doctor was noticing things were getting worse. I needed to increase my medication. So it was actually physically changing me. And that's what led to my medical leave because my doctor's like,
Okay.
you can't keep doing this. And I was like, yeah, you're right.
I feel
I
like
can't keep
people
doing
don't
this.
ever really understand how much stressful situations can affect our actual like physical health.
Yeah,
And you don't realize the toll that it's taking on your body, which can have like long-term effects. So
exactly.
I'm
Yeah.
glad that you had a good doctor to be like, whoa, you
I
need to
am so blessed with this doctor. We've talked about like if he ever moves, like we might just move to wherever he goes because
he has to give you
to
the address.
to have a doctor that like he's been with me since my daughter was born and like he's
Mm.
just been amazing, has helped a lot with like my health journey and yeah, if he leaves like I don't know. It'll be a really tragic day for us. Um but yeah, and so the final kind of moment, can you hear her? Okay.
It's okay.
The final kind of moment that really changed things and where I agreed to go on that medical leave, which was hard for me to agree to do, to step back,
Hmm.
was there was going to be a change in who my supervisor was. And again,
Oh.
I wanted to be in a leadership role,
Hmm.
but in the position that I had, it was such a like a an in-between position. I was like a liaison between two teams. And so they wanted me to be even more frontline again and back to kind of crisis work. And it made sense for financial reasons, but for me, I was like, no, I don't, this isn't what I want to do. And so because they had me going into that position, they also needed to change who my supervisor was, which my supervisor was going to be somebody that I have known since I was in middle school and has been one of my best friends since middle school. And I was like,
No.
this is not gonna work. I was like, I can't be, I know I'm the type of person that needs to be reined in sometimes because I get passionate. I was like, I cannot be reprimanded by her on a
No.
Wednesday and then go party with her on a Friday. Like that's,
Totally.
she was good with the boundaries. She could separate things, but I was like, no,
Right.
I can't separate things. I wasn't okay with it. And that's the relationship piece. I felt as like if we go down this path, I think this would ruin my relationship with her. And
Mm,
again, this was a relationship that I had since middle school, since I was
right.
14, that I was like, I can't, it just doesn't work for me. And with that stress and everything else, my doctor was like, okay, let's go on medical leave. And I was like, all right, sounds good. And then within 3 days, I was like, I'm not able to return. Like, I know I cannot go back to that. There's just,
That's
yeah.
very impressive, to be honest, that you realized within 3 days. So slightly different for me. I didn't get put onto a medical leave, but well, I guess when I think back, I kind of did. I actually got very sick. And
Because your
I'm
body's
okay with it.
taking it
Like,
all.
yeah, and I think so I actually was very sick. I think I ended up with pneumonia. I was hospitalized. I ended up going into respiratory failure, and when I was brought back and whatnot, my doctor put me on a leave. And so I won't tell this whole story, but there is a part of me, because I loved the job that I was doing, even though I did see the possibility to like rank up or get into leadership roles. I really love I did love some of the groundwork that I was doing. And so there was
Yeah.
this part of me where I felt like I can't quit because all these people need me.
Hmm.
The people that we supported. And so um I then again it became down to the relationship where like somebody was becoming my superior and whatnot. And so weirdly similar stories, but slightly different. But I remember I couldn't wait to go back once my medical leave was
Yeah.
like over, and I was trying to figure out how to go back, face the burnout, and go back with boundaries. So I think that's really impressive that 3 days into your leave, you were like, no, no amount of time away from this is going to make me be able to go back and be the best I can be.
Yeah. I think it's partially because I knew nothing was going to be different in regards to the supervision.
Right.
We had conversation after conversation with the executive director at the time, and she was just not willing to budge. And I was like, this is a boundary. So when stating those boundaries, she was not willing to budge. And I didn't see I didn't see the value that I was bringing anymore.
Mm,
I couldn't do the work in the same capacity. Like I felt like I wasn't doing my best work anymore. That I was like, I'm replaceable. Like I understand every employee is replaceable. And I was like, maybe they just need someone fresh, somebody that is ready to continue to do that frontline work. And I
right.
did miss the clients because I did really love the client work. And I
Mhm.
think that's why, I'm still bringing that forward into what I'm doing today, is because I still love the client work. I needed kind of validation in a different way, because I knew I did good work with them, but I also knew I could support other new employees, social workers, whatever kind of background they had. I knew I could support them, but I just wasn't given the chance. And so,
Right.
within 3 days, which I guess did mess things up a little bit for them, because they were like, oh, well, we had somebody hired for the medical leave, but now we have to kind of rearrange things. But it all got sorted, and it just
Absolutely. Yeah.
it,
And that's not on you. I think that's like I think, again, some of that burnout, then there comes this like kind of like a level of guilt where you're like, well, if I do this, I'm going to leave these people high and dry. But at the same time, it's not like you just left and never came back. You had been
no,
trying, you've been in
yeah,
conversations and trying to have those conversations to make the changes to make it the best for everybody involved. But
yeah,
some of them were either unwilling or just not able to budge. And so that onus can't be put on you. And I think a lot of people, no matter whether you're trying to get into leadership roles or you're good at being a frontline worker or whatever that might be, I think a lot of us struggle with that level of just being like, it's not my fault. I've expressed my
hmm,
concerns or whatnot. And so we have to remember that, again, being in these situations where you're burnt out and feeling underappreciated or whatever those negative feelings could be, you have to be the one that takes charge of it and
yeah.
make the change. So
Well, and
obviously
we're
that's what you ended up doing.
Yeah, and we're not able to make decisions when we're in limbo. When we're
Mm,
in that, I think it's called liminal space. When you're in that in between, you can't make decisions because you are stuck. You're wondering the what ifs. If I go this direction or that direction, what's going to happen? And so if when a decision is made, it's like, well, finally those doors are closed. Nothing else is available to me
right.
there. I can finally make decisions to move forward. Same for the other people on the other side. They're like, okay, you're no longer an option. Now we're forced to make a decision. As uncomfortable and as frustrating as it might be, at least we can move forward and make some new choices or
Right.
whatever it looks like, right?
So with that being said, so I'm going to fast forward a little bit. So
Yeah.
obviously you left and decided to go off on your own. Was going off and being an entrepreneur and starting whatever line of business you were interested in starting, has that been something you had been thinking about previously?
No.
Was it like,
I had said I will never own my own business. I'm pretty sure I had been quoted that numerous times. My parents own their own business, so I had seen the
okay,
work that they did. Very different work. They were in oil and gas, but I had seen, the hours that it took, the money that it took, all of these things, and I was like, I'm never going to be my own boss. I'm never going to do that.
really?
Yeah, and so it hadn't crossed my mind. And even as like when I went to university, I started in psychology, and I was like, well, I don't want to go all the way and be like a psychologist sitting with somebody in an office talking about their feelings. Like I want to do other work, and that's where I fell into social work. And then it's
Okay.
funny that as I say never, it seems like that's what's going to happen for me at some point in my life. So never is not a word that I listen to very well. But yeah, I ended up
Very interesting because I
yeah.
feel like I know a lot of people that have said that. I will
Yeah.
I do not want to run my own business and whatnot. And they're and so far I feel like I know one other person who is was saying they would never run their own business and now they're running their own business. And I think too, like that's opening up your next level of hard. Because starting a
Yeah.
business is not easy. I can't imagine starting one in your field of work. I feel like
Yeah.
there's
There was a
thousand.
lot. Yeah, there was red tape in some capacity, but it's just a lot of unknowns.
Right.
As a BSW, so just having a bachelor's of social work, I had no idea if I was able to work with people in my own business. I had no idea if I was able to do one-on-one work because I hadn't seen it done. I knew that for psychologists, you need to have your master's to be able to
Okay.
be a counselor. But what confused me, and this is where my curiosity comes in and where I just
Okay.
dig and dig and dig, is that I was like, I was a counselor in my nonprofit organization. What makes it any different for me to be able to be there? Because I'm bringing the same skills.
Yeah.
I'm not a different person suddenly in private practice. There are just some differences in how I like who I would work with
Yeah. Okay.
and kind of some safety and things like that. There's some considerations that I needed to take, but my skill set wasn't different. So how could I be classified as a counselor in one space, but not a counselor in a different space? And that got me just questioning. And so I started searching. I actually wasn't even sure if I was going to stay on as social work at first. I knew at the time I was so burnt out that I could not take direction from anybody else. So out of stubbornness, I really couldn't find any other work because I didn't know how I could work for anybody at that moment. I also knew I still needed time to heal and my focus wasn't there. I was something that I've discovered years later now. In the last year and a half, I've been diagnosed with ADHD. So a late diagnosis with ADHD,
Mm-hmm.
which makes sense on how dysregulated I was and how
Mm,
challenging it was for me in forming my thoughts, thinking of path forward is because I was things that I was able to use as kind of my regular coping mechanisms and like my tools that I was using just weren't working for me anymore because I was just so emotionally exhausted and mentally exhausted. And I just didn't understand it at that time. And so I knew I couldn't work for anybody at that time. So I was like,
Fair.
well, I got to figure something out. So I thought I was going to do coaching because I had done that coaching
Yes.
course. I was like, well, at least this is something anybody can do. Anyone can be a coach.
Totally.
It's not too, like, you're not regulated. Just out of different curiosities and different questions, I started exploring, well, maybe I can be a social worker still, and maybe I can do some counseling, and finding the few people that were doing it. And eventually I applied for, there was a private practice roster on
Right.
our college that you could just apply to have your name out there, and they accepted me, and I took that as green light, go. So,
Oh,
and then with a lot of other questions around it, but
yeah.
for the most part, just being able to, well, why can't I do that?
Right.
Why do I have to accept that just because I don't see anyone else doing it? Maybe that just means
Totally.
that nobody really knows if they can't. There wasn't a clear statement from our college
Or
saying no.
maybe, not to assume, but maybe it was just a lot of people very similar to you that were stuck in that burnout phase, and they couldn't see that they needed to get
Yeah.
out and could use a support from someone who will understand what they are in. Because now you work with other social workers to
Hmm.
help them not end up where you were, correct? Like,
Yes.
was that fair of me to say?
Yeah. Or at
Yeah, I
least
think, like,
recognize that there's other options and that they can, yeah, I'm really proud of my branching out program. That kind of almost comes full circle for me because I wanted to so much like help other social workers when I was in the nonprofit world. So that way they were seeing their skills, but also, finding their boundaries and having their boundaries respected. And I was able to help students back then, but I just never could get into that leadership role.
right.
But now I've created a program that I'm supporting other social workers thinking about private practice and how to start up and what they need to consider. And it's a pretty cool program that
That's very
it's been
cool.
fun.
And I think, like, again, like I mentioned, the fact that you've been through the hard and the burnout and experienced that, worked your way through it to develop something that can be supportive, that is very powerful. I this year started with a life coach, and
Hmm.
no joke, I probably have met with a dozen. And I was like, I don't know, this just isn't a right fit. And I couldn't really figure out why. And then I actually found a life coach that has SMA like I do.
Mm,
And game changer.
yeah,
Because when people get you without you having to go down into every nitty gritty detail,
yeah,
like explaining a specific thing that you in your social worker role would have to deal with, you don't have to explain, they don't have to explain that to you. They can
yes.
call it its title and move on. And so that's a very powerful thing. So I bet that everyone you're working with really appreciates that additional level of understanding.
You want to be seen, right? We
Mhm.
all strive to be seen in some way and to be understood. And it's hard to voice some of those parts of us that we've just experienced. That's just kind of our life
Mhm.
and things and how our perspective has been with it. And until somebody else is like, hey, I didn't go through exactly the same, but I understand where you're coming from because I can relate in a different way. And you're like,
Exactly, because we're
thank
not
goodness.
cookie cutter.
Yeah.
We are not all in this cookie cutter thing. And, me, I know, like, the one thing for me when it came to coaching was I'm not somebody that's going to join the 5 a.m. club, and journaling does really nothing for me. There was other things where it would be like, get up and move your body. And I'd be like, I'm disabled. Like, that looks very different for me. And
Yeah.
so I didn't fit into those cookie cutter roles of many life and or business coaches because my life looks so different. So finding one that like really fit me was great because, again, although not the same life experiences, but a level of understanding that makes you feel seen and heard. So that's
Yeah.
really cool.
Yeah.
So one of the things I remember in your notes was something you said was your message you want to be leave people with or make sure we get out there to the world is that you're not starting over. You're just transferring. everything you know to something new. I thought that was like this very mind-blowing thing because even in the last year and a half, I literally feel like I've started over. I'm going down
Mm-hmm.
a very different path. And so maybe share a little bit more about your thoughts behind that, your reasoning, and if you have any like tips or tricks to help people
Yeah.
think that way as well.
In my first year of owning my business, I had to remind myself numerous times that I'm not new to social work. I'm just new to owning a business because there were so many things that I was learning, how to market yourself, how to keep your books, like how to figure out your
Right.
books, talk to an accountant, all the different things that were hard. It was challenging. But when I was sitting across,
Right. Okay. Okay. Apologize. It's very different. Okay. Right. Yeah. Very business based. Right. Totally. Absolutely. No, that's very smart because I do think that when any of us become into that phase of transitioning into something new, we do struggle with a lot of like self-worth, maybe. I struggled with like, but I've put all this time into this other thing and I'm just throwing it away. But I was like, no, when I can shift my mindset to being like, I'm not throwing it away, I'm just changing it over into something new. And yeah, I'm still able to do it. And there's skill sets that I've learned from the past that I can carry forward with me no matter where I go. So that's really awesome. Um, just being cognizant of the time. Tell people that are listening if you could give one really direct, clear piece of advice about inspiring people that whatever their hard thing is, they can overcome it. If you can give it, whether it's a tip, a quote, a tactic you've learned and used, could you share that with our listeners? I'm just throwing this at you. Oh, no. It's just been an inconvenience. Whatever. Right. Yes. That was good. That was really good. I'll be taking that and putting it into my own active practices. All right. So to wrap things up, let's tell people how can they work with you, who do you work with, and all the ways they can find you. Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on my podcast. I think you definitely touched another level that I was really hoping to reach to people in sharing that we all go through hard things in life, but those hard things don't have to define us, and we can just choose how we respond or react or move forward with them. So, thank you for coming on, and I will be in touch with you very soon. Thanks. Have a good day. Thanks for tuning in to the Can You Even podcast. I hope you're walking away feeling inspired, empowered, and ready to tackle your own You Can moments. If you loved this episode, be sure to follow, rate, and review the show. It helps me reach more people who need a little extra You Can energy in their lives. And hey, if you have a story to share, I'd love to hear it. Head to itsmecandice.com/podcast to apply to be a guest on the show. Until next time, remember, no matter what life throws your way, you can.